In the remote wilderness, danger can strike when you least expect it, and survival often hangs by a thread. From the icy Montana cabin shattered by a relentless grizzly, to the treacherous backcountry slopes where a bear ambushed 3 skiers in February 2025. In this video, you'll witness 6 stories that reveal how quickly isolation and wildlife collide, leaving humans vulnerable to the raw, unpredictable power of apex predators in breathtakingly real encounters. On the cold, fog-choked morning of November 1st, 2025, the Montana wilderness lay silent beneath a thin layer of frost that glittered under the faint light of a waning moon. Inside a small, isolated cabin perched near the edge of a dense pine forest, Mark and Rachel Turner slept unaware of the approaching danger that had picked up their scent from the stored game meat hanging just beyond the back porch, its odor drifting on the icy wind into the ears and nose of a massive grizzly that had been roaming the mountains for days, seeking an easy meal before winter deepened. The bear moved with a terrifying combination of stealth and raw power, its heavy paws pressing into the frozen ground with soft thuds that were nearly lost beneath the occasional groan of the cabin settling in the cold. Then, in an instant, the quiet was shattered as the animal surged forward, crashing through the underbrush with a force that rattled tree branches and sent birds into the night sky. Before either Mark or Rachel could fully awaken, the enormous bulk of the grizzly struck the porch, splintering railings, snapping the support beams, and shaking the cabin in a way that felt as if the very earth had moved beneath them. Mark's eyes flew open to the sound of splintering wood and a guttural roar that vibrated through his chest. At the same time, Rachel bolted upright, clutching the blankets to her chest as fear constricted her throat. Together, they realized the unimaginable truth. A predator larger than any they had ever imagined was inside their home, drawn by hunger and the irresistible scent of meat. The bear's massive claws scraped against the door as it tore at the wood with terrifying efficiency, each swipe sending shards of splintered timber across the floorboards and leaving gouges deep enough to expose the cabin's interior to the cold night air. Mark lunged for the rifle that leaned against the wall, fumbling briefly as his fingers, stiff with sleep and panic, struggled to secure the safety and rack a shell into the chamber. At the same time, Rachel crawled toward the heavier table in the corner, instinct telling her to take cover, every instinct screaming that this was a fight for survival. The bear's first swipe through the doorway sent the old wooden table Mark had used for chopping firewood crashing to the floor, tossing kindling and other supplies like paper in a storm. And as the creature entered the cabin, the weight of its bulk pressed down on the floorboards, making them groan under an impact that felt impossibly heavy. At the same time, it slammed into a stack of chairs, sending them skidding across the room and scattering Rachel's carefully prepared emergency supplies. Rachel dove beneath the nearest solid surface, pressing her back against the cold wood as she watched the grizzly circle, each breath rattling in her chest, while the bear's low growls and panting filled the room, punctuated by the crashing of furniture, the snapping of timber, and the occasional thud of the bear's paw against a wall or window. Sparks from a lantern, jarred from its hook during the chaos, skittered across the floorboards, igniting scattered papers that curled and blackened as smoke began to fill the cabin, adding a choking, acrid layer to the already overwhelming terror. Mark fired the rifle once, the report echoing through the cabin and into the surrounding trees. But the bear, driven by either hunger or the sheer shock of opportunity, barely flinched. With a swipe of its massive paw, it knocked the rifle aside, sending it sliding across the floor as Mark was forced back against the wall, feeling the full power of the animal in a way that made every muscle in his body tense with the urgent need to survive. The bear seized the moment to grab the carcass of a frozen deer that had been left on the porch, dragging it inside with terrifying strength, shaking it as if it were nothing more than a toy. At the same time, splintered wood and scattered belongings created a chaotic battlefield around it. Rachel pressed herself closer to the table's support beams, her hands gripping the rough edges as if the wood could somehow anchor her against the storm of raw power that moved through the cabin. Every second stretched unbearably long, each movement of the grizzly an unpredictable threat that could crush, swipe, or gore in an instant, leaving the Turners caught in a suspended nightmare where awareness of their isolation amplified every heartbeat and every thought of what might happen next. Minutes felt like hours as the bear tore through the cabin, smashing through windows, scattering supplies, and dragging the deer back toward the doorway, its claws leaving deep gouges along walls and ceilings, the smell of blood, sweat, and animal musk filling the room and mingling with smoke from the burning papers. Mark found a moment to scramble for a second rifle, this one heavier and loaded with a larger caliber, and braced himself, knowing he could not afford to miss. Still, the bear, sensing the threat, hesitated only briefly before retreating, seemingly satisfied with the damage and chaos it had wrought, and perhaps realizing the humans were not as easy prey as it had assumed. With one final earth-shaking roar that reverberated through the trees, the grizzly bolted through the broken doorway into the frost-covered night, disappearing into the shadows of the surrounding forest. At the same time, the Turners, bruised, scratched, and shaking from adrenaline and fear, slowly emerged from their makeshift shelter beneath the table. By dawn, the cabin lay in near-total ruin. Glass lay scattered like ice crystals across the floor. Walls bore deep claw marks. Furniture was smashed and overturned. Supplies were strewn across every surface, and the lingering smoke of the burned papers mixed with the cold mountain air to create a haze that made breathing difficult. Mark and Rachel huddled together in silence, each instinctively checking the other for injuries, realizing that survival had been a mixture of quick thinking, luck, and sheer endurance, while also understanding in a deeper, more frightening way just how vulnerable isolation in grizzly country could make even the most prepared and experienced people. The forest outside returned to its quiet, frost-bound calm, leaving only the wreckage of the cabin and the vivid memory of the bear's unstoppable presence as evidence that, in the remote Montana mountains, life could be broken, torn, and nearly stolen in the course of a single terrifying night. On the morning of June 12, 2020, Kodiak Island lay swathed in a thin veil of fog that clung low over the salmon-filled river, the gray mist swirling across the water like smoke from a distant fire. And as Simon Hayes and his colleague Alex Moreno paddled their kayaks carefully through the narrow, twisting channels, their eyes scanning the banks for wildlife, the river whispered beneath their blades, icy water pressing cold and relentless against their arms, while the scent of fresh fish and riverweed mixed with the faint tang of salt carried from the bay beyond, oblivious to the predator lurking just beyond the spruce line. Simon adjusted his life vest and tightened the straps on his camera equipment, intent on documenting the movement of the salmon and the occasional flash of eagles above, unaware that the dense trees that lined the riverbank concealed something far more dangerous than the occasional bird or moose, something that had been watching them for minutes, gauging movement, scent, and opportunity. A massive male Kodiak bear, its fur dark and bristling with the morning damp, muscles coiled beneath its shaggy frame, and eyes locked with a predatory focus that zeroed in on Simon's bright kayak, as though it were a target the bear had chosen long before either man had stepped onto the water. The river narrowed suddenly, forcing the kayaks closer together and closer to the bank where the bear crouched, its massive paws sinking slightly into the soft, mossy ground, claws gleaming faintly in the diffused light, and for a heartbeat, the morning seemed suspended in uneasy silence, the kind that grips the chest and makes the skin prickle with anticipation, before the bear erupted into motion with terrifying speed, crashing through the undergrowth in a controlled surge of raw power that sent water droplets spraying into the fog as it lunged toward the riverbank, eyes fixed, teeth bared, every ounce of its enormous body committed to the charge. Simon barely had time to react, raising his paddle instinctively, as the bear's first swipe hit the kayak, slamming against the side with a sound like a tree snapping under immense pressure. Before Simon could brace himself, the craft tipped violently, throwing him into the icy water, the river immediately seizing him in its swift, merciless current. At the same time, the fog twisted and rolled over him like a living thing, threatening to pull him under with every wave and rapid that barreled him forward. Alex screamed, the sound swallowed instantly by the roar of water and the bear's growls as he struggled to maneuver his own kayak closer to the bank, paddles slashing through the water in desperate arcs. But the bear moved with terrifying purpose, grabbing Simon's pack with one powerful paw and dragging it into the spruce, tearing it from the overturned kayak, and Simon, clinging to the currents and tangled in ropes, cameras, and fishing gear, was immediately caught in the struggle between survival and the river's relentless pull, the icy water pressing into his lungs and numbing his limbs while boulders and submerged logs struck him with sudden, crushing force as he was swept downstream. The roar of the bear followed him briefly, a visceral reminder of the predator's presence and lethal power, before fading slightly as the animal retreated into the trees with its prize, leaving Simon to the merciless river, its currents hurling him under rocks, over rapids, and around jagged bends, each collision twisting his body and gear in ways that moved nearly impossible. At the same time, adrenaline burned a frantic path through his veins, forcing him to cling, to fight, to survive, even as the water dragged him farther from any hope of safety. Alex finally managed to bring his kayak to the shore, collapsing on the mud and gravel, drenched to the bone, trembling violently as he scrambled to peer downstream, catching only brief glimpses of Simon's flailing limbs before the man disappeared entirely beneath the frothing water, swallowed by the river's violent embrace, leaving Alex with nothing but the echoing roars of the bear and the stark, terrifying silence that followed its departure. The river now dotted with pieces of broken kayaks, scattered gear, and deep claw marks along the mossy banks where the animal had tested its strength against man and machine alike. His mind raced as he tried to make sense of the chaos, aware that every second he spent on shore was a second too long, that Simon's life depended on the whims of water and gravity, both as indiscriminate and merciless as the predator they had just encountered. Hours passed like slow, grinding agony as Alex clung to the riverbank, shivering violently in his soaked clothes, scanning every bend, every whitecap, every shadow along the fog-drenched water for some sign of his friend. The fog thickening and thinning unpredictably, the sun rising behind layers of clouds and doing nothing to warm the chill that settled in his bones. And when rescuers finally arrived, their faces pale and eyes wide with the realization of what had occurred, they worked with careful precision, pulling broken kayaks and equipment from the water, searching through rapids and eddies with ropes and lines, before they found Simon's body downstream, battered, cold, and lifeless. A stark and haunting testament to the brutal combination of predator and river that had claimed him with inexorable force. The riverbank where the attack had occurred bore evidence of the encounter in every claw mark etched deep into the spruce and along moss-covered rocks, and in Alex's memory, forever marked by the sudden violent intrusion of the Kodiak bear into what had begun as an ordinary morning, reminding him that in the remote wilds of Kodiak Island, power and speed could converge in a single terrifying instant, leaving only wreckage, grief, and the lasting impression of one of North America's most formidable predators, acting with instinct, precision, and lethal inevitability. On October 3, 2024, Olivia Bennett climbed a steep granite ridge in Montana, moving carefully with every foot and hand placement. Her rope was coiled over her shoulder, and a light pack was secured tightly against her back. The early afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the rock face, and the air carried the sharp scent of pine and earth, mixed with the faint chill that hinted winter would arrive soon. Olivia was scouting a new route, solo, testing the granite for cracks and ledges that might support a future ascent, and each careful movement reminded her how exposed she was on the narrow, unbroken ridge. The mountains around her seemed still, quiet, and unyielding, the silence only broken by distant bird calls and the scrape of rock under her boots. Halfway up the ridge, as she paused to check her chalked hands and adjust her rope, a low guttural grunt echoed from a nearby outcropping, resonating through the rocks and tightening the muscles in her shoulders. Olivia froze, every instinct alert, her eyes scanning the ridge below and the scrubby forest at its base. And through the thin trees, she saw it, a massive black bear, drawn by the faint scent of food she had left near her base camp. The animal moved with deliberate strength, pawing at loose rocks and testing the ridge as if to measure its limits, each movement causing small stones to tumble downward and echo against the mountainside. Olivia's chest tightened, her fingers curling instinctively around her rope, and she realized how quickly solitude in these mountains could turn from peaceful to dangerous. The bear's eyes locked on her, and for a tense moment it stood still, its black fur gleaming faintly in the sun, muscles rippling beneath the thick coat as it judged its approach. Then it lunged. Olivia's heart raced as she scrambled toward a narrow ledge that offered slightly more security, her fingers trembling as they found tiny holds in the granite, her boots slipping occasionally on the smooth surface. The bear swiped at her with powerful claws, scraping along her jacket and shredding the fabric within inches of her body. She pressed herself flat against the rock, the scent of pine and adrenaline thick in her nose, her muscles straining to keep her balance. Each swipe sent loose stones clattering down the slope, and the sheer drop beside her reminded her that one mistake could be fatal. Olivia inched along the ledge, balancing precariously, every movement calculated to avoid a fall while putting distance between herself and the bear, her heart hammering so loudly she feared it might give her position away. The bear followed, circling and pawing at the ridge, growling low and deep, testing her patience and her resolve, its head tilting and eyes glinting as if it were sizing her up as prey. The minutes stretched long, each second weighted with fear, the wind carrying the bear's scent to her in sharp waves that seemed to fill her chest with icy tension. She focused on each handhold and foothold, forcing herself to move carefully despite the trembling of her arms and legs. Finally, she reached a small overhang, a natural shelter just wide enough to keep the bear from reaching her with its massive paws, and she collapsed briefly against the granite, gasping for air as adrenaline surged and left her muscles trembling. Below, the bear circled once more, pawing rocks and sniffing at the ledge where she had been exposed, before eventually retreating toward the forest, drawn away by the faint scent of her base camp, or perhaps deciding the effort was not worth the risk. Olivia remained still for several minutes after the bear's departure, her body coated in sweat and fine dust from the granite, scrapes marking her arms and legs. She realized fully how vulnerable even an experienced climber could be when an apex predator intersected with exposed terrain. When she finally climbed down to firmer ground, her arms sore and clothes torn, she paused to survey the ridge she had just survived, noting how quickly isolation could become lethal, how even precise technique and years of climbing experience offered no guarantee against the raw power and unpredictability of wildlife in its natural environment. Her pack and gear were intact, thankfully. Still, the memory of the bear's claws swiping mere inches from her body remained vivid, a chilling reminder of the danger that lurked beyond the beauty of the Montana wilderness. Every sound of snapping branches or shifting rock reminded her of the encounter, and she moved deliberately as she descended, knowing that survival in these mountains was never guaranteed, and that the combination of steep terrain, solitude, and a predator's instinct could turn a routine climb into a fight to live. By the time Olivia reached the base of the ridge, her muscles burned, and her clothes were stained with dust and blood from minor scrapes. Still, her mind remained alert, cataloging every detail of the bear's approach, every sound, every movement, and every second that had stretched like an eternity. The encounter had reinforced a truth she had long known but rarely confronted so vividly. In the wild, skill and experience could delay disaster, but they could not remove the threat entirely. Apex predators demanded respect, caution, and constant awareness, and even a climber like Olivia Bennett, trained and confident, had been reminded that the margins between life and death in the mountains were dangerously thin, and that any misstep, any moment of hesitation, could have had fatal consequences. On October 12, 2018, the small village of Esso in Russia's far east, bustling under the muted light of a gray autumn morning. The schoolyard stirred with the rhythm of daily routines as children hurried between classes, their laughter carrying brightly across the crisp air, mingling with the scent of pine, earth, and freshly packed lunches scattered on tables and benches. Beyond the fenced yard, the taiga rose sharply, dense with birch, spruce, and fir, its floor littered with fallen leaves and rotting fruit that had been tossed from the school windows or forgotten in lunch containers, carrying an aroma that drifted enticingly into the forest and reached the sensitive nose of a massive Russian grizzly, wandering in search of food after its habitat had been disrupted by logging operations farther up the slope. The bear, emaciated and tense from weeks of hunger, had moved cautiously through the trees, sniffing, testing the undergrowth with its enormous paws, each step leaving deep impressions in the soft soil, until it emerged from a thicket beside a small creek that cut behind the school buildings, suddenly visible and impossibly close, its black eyes gleaming with raw intensity as it assessed the open yard before it. The first reaction was chaos. The bear charged, crashing through the edge of the forest with terrifying speed, its bulk shaking the ground beneath the fallen leaves, scattering swings, benches, and bicycles as if they were toys. Children screamed and ran, feet pounding the concrete as teachers scrambled to close doors and usher students inside. But 10-year-old Pavel Orlov, carrying a backpack and distracted by a ball rolling near a storage shed, tripped and fell, arms outstretched, unable to regain his balance before the massive predator struck. The bear's first contact was brutal, a swift blow that sent Pavel sprawling to the ground, his small frame no match for the animal's raw power. The sound of the impact echoed through the yard, silencing the fleeing children for a brief, heart-stopping moment. Nearby, teacher Irina Sokolov, already in motion to secure the remaining students, spotted the bear and the boy. Acting on instinct, she grabbed a long metal rod from the storage area and waved it, shouting as loudly as she could. Each motion was intended to confuse and distract the bear, pulling its attention away from the prone child. The bear hesitated, sniffing the air and grunting low, then pawed at the ground and the shed, temporarily retreating a few steps back toward the forest edge, growling in frustration at the sudden obstacle. Irina pressed herself forward, continuing to make noise, her heart pounding and sweat running down her back despite the cool autumn air, knowing that every second counted and that the creature could turn its full force on them at any instant. Villagers, alerted by the screams and the sound of crashing metal and snapping wood, began arriving from nearby homes, some grabbing tools. In contrast, others climbed onto raised platforms or fences to gain safety while keeping a watchful eye on the bear. By the time they reached the schoolyard, the bear had begun to move back toward the creek, distracted by the human presence, and perhaps calculating the cost of staying versus retreating. But it was too late for Pavel. His small body had already suffered the force of blunt trauma, evident to rescuers even before they reached him. The ground around him marked with shallow grooves where the bear had pawed at the area, and the boy's belongings, backpack, lunchbox, a small sweater, lay scattered and torn across the yard. The aftermath left the schoolyard in ruins. Benches were overturned, swings twisted and broken, bicycles scattered and scratched with deep claw marks, and the earth bore paw prints several inches deep, pressed into the soft soil by the immense weight of the bear. Teachers and villagers moved cautiously among the debris, securing the remaining children and surveying the damage. At the same time, emergency responders from the district arrived, bringing ropes, vehicles, and radios to communicate with authorities in the region. Each person who had witnessed the attack carried the vivid memory of the bear's sudden appearance and the terrifying speed with which it had struck. The intensity of the sound and the sheer size of the animal that could appear from the forest as if conjured by the autumn fog. Even after the bear retreated into the dense forest, leaving only the overturned items and paw prints behind, the lesson remained clear and chilling. Human settlements that border wild habitats are inherently vulnerable, especially when apex predators are displaced from their traditional ranges by logging or other human activity. Pavel's death was sudden, unavoidable in the context of the bear's size, hunger, and force, and his classmates and teachers were left to process a trauma that had arrived in seconds, reminding everyone that the boundaries between human territory and wildlife territory could collapse in moments, with consequences that were permanent and devastating. As villagers worked to repair fences and reassure frightened children, the forest beyond the creek remained quiet, hiding the massive form of the bear that had caused such destruction, waiting and watching from the shadows, a reminder that nature could not be fully controlled, and that encounters between humans and wildlife, particularly displaced or starving predators, could erupt without warning into chaos and tragedy. Irina Sokolov later recounted the events with vivid clarity. The bear had moved too fast for anyone to intervene effectively, its focus entirely on the opportunity before it, and even experienced adults were powerless to prevent what had happened. The yard, once a place of laughter and play, was now a stark lesson in the consequences of human-wildlife interaction. The debris, claw marks, and personal items of the victims were a haunting record of an encounter that had lasted less than a minute, but would be remembered for a lifetime. In the end, the small village returned to routine as best it could, children resuming lessons under careful supervision, fences reinforced, and the community discussing ways to reduce attractants that might draw bears closer in the future. Yet the memory of that morning, the suddenness of the bear's charge, and the tragic loss of young Pavel remained, a lasting reminder of how quickly the line between safety and danger can vanish when apex predators roam near human spaces, and how vulnerable even familiar everyday places become when the wild asserts itself in force. On February 18, 2025, the Montana backcountry lay pristine and untouched, sunlight glinting off fresh snow that blanketed steep slopes, turning the mountains into a dazzling white expanse that hid every contour and shadow with deceptive beauty. 3 skiers, Anna, Lucas, and Miguel, moved cautiously down a remote descent far from any groomed trails, their breaths rising in clouds as they navigated narrow gullies, snow-laden trees, and hidden drops, their skis cutting shallow grooves into powder that had fallen silently over the previous night. Each turn required focus, as every slope was assessed for hidden obstacles. Meanwhile, the early afternoon light cast long, shifting shadows across the terrain, masking dangers that could be concealed just beyond the tree line. The air carried the faint scent of pine and snow, mixed with the tang of energy bars and sandwiches packed for the day. And beneath it all, the mountains remained indifferent, vast and silent, harboring whatever creatures moved unseen within their folds. As the trio neared a partially frozen creek that cut through a grove of spruce, a low, resonant growl broke the quiet. shaking the air in a way that caused snow to shift from branches overhead and made their hearts leap. Anna's gaze swept the trees, and through the gaps, she saw it. A massive grizzly, its dark fur glinting faintly under the afternoon sun, muscles tensing with each movement as it sniffed the air, drawn by the smell of packed lunches and the backpack a previous group of hikers had left hidden near the creek. The bear moved with terrifying deliberation, each step crunching against the frozen undergrowth as it stepped closer to the edge of the tree line, its nostrils flaring, its eyes fixed on the nearest skier. The three friends froze instinctively, aware immediately that the quiet, beautiful mountainscape had transformed into a battlefield where survival depended on rapid decisions and split-second reactions. Without warning, the bear charged. Its roar echoed across the slopes, ricocheting between cliffs and gullies like a rolling avalanche, sending birds flapping into the air and snow cascading from the higher slopes. Lucas, nearest to the creek, stumbled over a hidden rock, dropping his ski poles as he tumbled sideways, and the bear's first swipe tore through his jacket and dug deep into his shoulder, pain flaring instantly as he tried to roll free while clutching the wound. Anna and Miguel reacted immediately, raising their ski poles and flares, swinging them to create noise and movement that might distract the predator, each motion tense, arms trembling, breath coming fast in the icy air. The bear paused for a heartbeat, snorting and pawing at the snow, then lunged again, faster than either of them could anticipate, claws raking across the slope in a blur of strength and power that left gouges in the powder and sent small rocks and ice tumbling downhill. Minutes stretched unbearably, each second loaded with fear, as the bear circled, lunged, and retreated only to strike again, its eyes never leaving its perceived prey. At the same time, the skiers did their best to navigate the steep terrain. Anna's gloved hands were raw from swinging poles. Miguel's legs burned as he pivoted and skidded to avoid the bear's swipes, and Lucas, bleeding and grimacing, struggled to maintain footing on the icy, uneven snow as he tried to shield himself with whatever movement he could muster. Snow sprayed around them with every strike, echoing against the trees and cliffs, while the roar of the bear dominated the mountainscape. This primal sound reminded them of the sheer scale and lethality of the apex predator before them. At one point, the bear seized Lucas's backpack, dragging it several feet across the snow while sniffing at the half-eaten sandwich inside, then paused, growling and pawing at the slope as if testing whether the humans posed any real threat. The skiers pressed themselves against nearby trees and rocks wherever possible, using the terrain as cover while attempting to redirect the bear's attention with poles and flares. Still, each movement required extreme care, knowing that one misstep could mean being struck again or worse, thrown down the steep incline. The bear's focus was relentless, its energy seemingly endless, its instincts honed by survival in the harsh Montana wilderness, and the skiers realized that luck and quick thinking were their only shields against the force bearing down upon them. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the bear retreated uphill, disappearing into the grove of spruce with Lucas's backpack clutched in its massive jaws, leaving only claw marks in the snow and the smell of exertion and fur behind. The three skiers collapsed to the slope, shaking, bruised, and bleeding, hearts racing as they took in the aftermath. Deep gouges along the powder, broken branches, disturbed snow, and the echoes of their fear still resonating across the empty mountains. Lucas's shoulder bled freely. Anna's hands were scraped raw from gripping ski poles, and Miguel's thighs burned from the frantic maneuvering that had kept him alive. Still, all three were profoundly aware of the narrow margin that had separated survival from catastrophe, and how even the pristine, open slopes of the backcountry could conceal a predator capable of destroying them in moments. As they gathered themselves and slowly made their way down toward safer terrain, leaning on each other where possible, they reflected silently on the encounter, understanding that in the wilderness, preparation, awareness, and instinct could save lives, but that nature's unpredictability demanded respect and humility at every step. The snow-covered slope, which had appeared inviting and beautiful only minutes before, now felt treacherous, every shadow a potential hiding place, every sound a possible warning. And the lesson they carried with them was both clear and terrifying. Apex predators are not bound by human schedules, distances, or perceptions of safety, and even the most careful adventurers can find themselves in a life-or-death struggle when a hungry, powerful animal chooses to assert its dominance in its territory. On August 21st, 2023, the dense forests of northern Romania were alive with the quiet hum of late summer, sunlight filtering through layers of oak, beech, and fir, while the undergrowth rustled faintly with the movement of deer, birds, and the occasional fox. Eric Novak, a wildlife enthusiast and experienced caretaker, moved along a narrow trail toward a semi-wild enclosure several miles from his sanctuary, checking on a brown bear that he had raised from a cub. The bear, once small enough to fit in his arms, now weighed more than 600 pounds of solid muscle, its size and strength a constant reminder that even familiarity could not diminish the instincts honed over decades in the wild. Eric carried a backpack containing monitoring equipment, a first aid kit, and a flare gun. Although he approached the enclosure with confidence, born of years of handling the animal, he remained vigilant, aware that the unpredictability of apex predators demanded respect. The bear's enclosure, a broad, fenced area nestled within a hollow of mixed forest and open meadow, had been designed to allow it a semi-wild existence, giving it room to roam while still being monitored after relocation. Eric had visited the site twice a week since the bear's transfer, observing its adaptation, noting behavior patterns, and occasionally providing supplemental food. Today, he was confident that the animal recognized him, that the bond formed during its formative years would prevent aggression. As he neared the enclosure, he spotted the bear moving through a patch of ferns and low shrubs, large paws pressing deep into the soft earth, its dark eyes following him without apparent hostility, the powerful frame moving with deliberate grace across uneven terrain. Without warning, a rustling in the underbrush to Eric's right startled the bear. A small animal, perhaps a deer fawn or a stray dog, darted past, and in an instant the bear's instincts overrode the familiarity it had with Eric. It lunged with terrifying speed, paws pounding against the forest floor, muscles coiled and released in a burst of force that sent leaves and branches scattering. Eric froze, shock registering before instinct could respond, then tried to step back calmly, speaking in low tones he hoped would remind the bear of their bond. But the animal's response was not reasoned or sentimental. It was purely instinctual, and within seconds it swiped violently, striking Eric against a fallen tree with the force of its massive shoulder, knocking the breath from his lungs and leaving him scrambling to regain balance. Pinned under the bear's weight and partially shielded by the fallen log, Eric struggled, adrenaline surging through him as he attempted to protect his head and torso. Still, the bear's claws tore through clothing and flesh with brutal precision, slashing arms and legs, raking across his back and driving him to the forest floor. Pain exploded in waves, each movement sending shock through his body, while the bear circled briefly, growling low and deep, its instincts attuned to any movement that might signify vulnerability. Eric clawed at the ground, trying to push himself away, breathe, and find leverage, but the size and power of the animal were overwhelming. Hearing the commotion, nearby colleagues who had been observing from a safe distance reacted immediately, firing flares into the air and shouting in an attempt to distract the bear and create noise and flashes that might redirect its attention away from Eric. The bear hesitated, snapping its head toward the flares and growling in confusion, but only temporarily. Each step and paw movement still radiated raw power and intent. Minutes dragged on like hours as Eric remained trapped beneath the assault, every second filled with the desperate struggle to survive, muscles screaming, skin raw, and mind racing through memories of training, past encounters, and the realization that the bear he had nurtured as a cub now existed on its own terms, guided entirely by instinct. Finally, the bear retreated, moving back into the shadows of the forest with powerful strides, leaving behind only the scent of its presence and the devastation wrought in moments of ungoverned strength. Eric lay on the forest floor, bleeding heavily, bruised and broken, the echo of the bear's growls fading but leaving a permanent mark on his body and mind. Colleagues rushed to his side, applying pressure to wounds, checking for breathing, and signaling emergency responders, but it was immediately clear that the severity of his injuries was overwhelming. Despite rapid intervention, Eric succumbed to blunt force trauma and massive lacerations, a stark reminder that even a lifelong familiarity with an apex predator could not mitigate the animal's instinctual response when startled or provoked. The forest around the enclosure returned to its quiet state, leaves whispering in the wind and sunlight falling through the trees, masking the horror that had just occurred. The bear, now fully wild once again, disappeared into the dense thickets, leaving behind the evidence of its power. Deep claw marks on the ground and logs, trampled undergrowth, and the stark absence of the man who had once nurtured it. The tragedy resonated deeply with the colleagues who had witnessed the attack, and with the wildlife community, serving as a grim illustration of how unpredictable and dangerous apex predators can remain, even when a bond of years exists between humans and animals. Eric Novak's death underscored the stark truth that no familiarity can erase the fundamental instincts of creatures shaped by the wild. A bear may recognize a face or a scent. Still, when survival instincts are triggered by a sudden movement, an unfamiliar noise, or a perceived threat, their reaction is neither sentimental nor negotiable. The forest, beautiful and tranquil, had been the stage for a violent assertion of power and instinct, and the memory of the attack lingered in the minds of those present, haunting and sobering, a reminder that respect for wildlife must always accompany observation, care, and admiration. Even after the bear had vanished from sight, colleagues remained cautious, securing the area and reviewing protocols to prevent similar tragedies. The forest itself offered no apologies, no indications that the violence had occurred beyond the trampled ferns and broken branches. Yet the lessons were stark. Instinctual behavior in apex predators is absolute. Bonds of familiarity cannot override raw strength and survival mechanisms, and humans, no matter their experience or intent, remain vulnerable when encountering animals whose nature is both majestic and lethal. The semi-wild enclosure would continue to serve its purpose. Still, Eric's death became a permanent reminder of the limits of control and understanding, and the delicate line between care and danger in the presence of creatures whose power dwarfs human certainty.